Welcome back, and we have the honor of welcoming Hugo Veazey to the stage today. Hugo is the Director of Anti-Financial Crime Solution at Moody's Analyst. Hugo joined RDC, which is now Moody's Analytics, in 2019 as a Director of Anti-Financial Crime Solutions. And he splits his time evenly between thought leadership and providing an internal point of compliance reference and developing relationships with existing and prospective clients with a view to providing maximum screening efficiency. Ladies and gentlemen, it's the talk we've been waiting for. Welcome, Hugo, to the screen. Over to you, Hugo.
Thank you very much indeed, Jenny. I do appreciate the introduction. That's very kind of you. Thank you. Just to put a little bit of context behind it as well, whilst I've worked in compliance for the last 8 years or so, prior to that, I was about 23 years working in relationship banking as well. So I'm a bit of a poacher turned gamekeeper and can certainly speak with a foot in each camp in terms of front and middle office. But today, what I'd like to talk to you good people about is how technology can be used as a facilitator to overcome regulatory hurdles. And I'd obviously like to thank the folks here for inviting us along to talk about this to you today. We're going to try to keep it as brief as possible. There might be time for questions and answers at the end, but don't worry if not. If you have questions, put them in the chat, and we'll certainly respond to those in the fullness of time. But again, I just wanted to run through a few high-level points. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, a hurdle is defined as a problem or a difficulty that must be solved or dealt with before you can achieve something. And obviously what we're endeavouring to solve here are problems relating to regulatory requirements, and what we need to achieve is compliance with those regulatory requirements, both in terms of the letter but also the spirit of the regulation that is in place. Technology clearly is an invaluable asset in a fight against financial crime and defending ourselves against potential reputational damage caused by bad actors. By doing this, we are more likely to exceed the expectations of our regulators and maintain a healthy book of business. Today, I would like us to consider 4 key areas for discussion, and I invite questions, as I mentioned, during the presentation, although we hopefully will have some time at the end for Q&A, and we've also got a few poll questions as well. I would very much appreciate your thoughts. But Jenny, if we could move on to the next slide, please. Wonderful. So I'd like to start by discussing some headlines with you. It is estimated by the United Nations that in 2020, between 2 and 5% of global gross domestic product is laundered annually. Bureau van Dijk Moody's Analytics Know Your Customer business detects and deters bad actors by curating the world's most comprehensive risk intelligent data sets, and we deliver actionable insights through advanced analytics to bring transparency to global business relationships. And our work detects, disrupts, and prevents fraud, terrorism, and financial crime, empowering customers to make better, faster decisions. And that will be very much core to what we're talking about today. So again, I'll just really quickly add a little bit of context to some of those headlines. Europol, dear to my heart, obviously, because I'm based in Europe, although obviously the UK is no longer part of the European Union. But Europol estimates that approximately 1% of the EU's annual gross domestic product is detected as being involved in suspect financial activity. Now, I'm going to call out the key word there, suspect, because if you don't know and understand your client and know what is normal for them, you can't ideally say what is suspect. You can't say this is irregular or suspicious. But again, I just wanted to put a little bit of context to that, and I'll let you do the maths. The European Union's GDP was estimated to be around $15 trillion nominally in 2020. And that represents roughly 1/6 or 17% of the global economy. Now, even if it was only just 1% of that, that is still in the hundreds of billions of funds that effectively Europol are saying we can't legitimately account for. So again, it provides an indication as to why BVD, Moody's and RDC take this area so seriously. And again, we look at the way that we can configure our screening solutions using AI front end and back end of the process as well. But I won't dwell on that too much. But again, Jimmy, if you could move on to the next slide for me, please. Wonderful. So again, I want to talk about technology being our friend. I want to talk about compliance being seen as a good cost. I want to talk about people, data, and technology. And I would like to finish with a facilitation of the move towards perpetual or ongoing KYC. Now, again, technology exists for a reason. We need to remove paper files. I've worked in organizations recently where paper files are still prevalent. That is clearly not fit for purpose. But we also need to have consistency. We need to understand the ability of robotic process automation and how we can get the computers to be consistent but do the heavy lifting for us, which means that the skilled analysts that we will always need have better data that they can more accurately reflect upon and make better, faster decisions. Regulators, as we are aware, are becoming more knowledgeable and understanding of the impact of technology, and certainly in the UK we've had Financial Conduct Authority sprints where they're looking at this specifically, and equally again in Europe the most recent EU directive refers to technology often and mentions the need for adequacy, and that is also adequate technology, adequate staff, receiving adequate training as well. So it's a recognition across the board, and as I said, this is 1/6 of the global economy we're talking about. It's got to be done, and it's got to be done better. Now, I talk in point number 2 about compliance being seen as a facilitator. Typically, a lot of the organizations that I've worked in, it's seen as a bad cost or a negative cost. It's not productive. I would obviously argue to the contrary, and I would argue that it is actually the license to trade. It is, in fact, the reason for a business being able to continue. And it's the relationship between the front and the middle office, or sales and compliance, as we would typically refer to them, in association with the third line or the back office function, which would typically be internal audit. So again, it's important that we get those 3 stakeholders on board, because without a compliance function, sales can't sell. But obviously, if sales aren't selling, there is no compliance function because they're not generating enough revenue to justify keeping members of staff. So there is that interreliance. We talk about people and data and technology, clearly inextricably interlinked. People are fundamentally important. The data is growing and expanding, which is fine, but what are we going to do with it? Well, what we do with it is use technology, as I mentioned before, to provide the information to the people so that they can make the decisions. So it's an absolute critical component of the success of any organization. And again, it's important that we get the balance right. So finally, on point number 4, facilitation of a move towards perpetual KYC. In English, what we talk about when we refer to perpetual KYC is not rigidly adhering to prescriptive and largely arbitrary review cycles of 1 year for high risk, every other year for medium risk, and every 3 years, or sometimes even every 5 years for low risk clients. And again, it varies from organization to organization. But I'm going to make the point here that we need to understand our client. Just knowing your client or KYC is no longer adequate, if indeed it ever was. And the example that I use here, we know that a tomato is a fruit, right? That's knowledge. Not putting it in a fruit salad is powerful. So knowledge on its own is not power. It's what we do with that knowledge that generates that power. So it's understanding here, what does our client do? What does our client's clients do? Who owns our client? But more importantly, who controls our client? And we need to understand these factors. We need to know where their primary lines of business are, where their key jurisdictions are. We need to understand if any of those circumstances change. From a risk-based approach perspective, that in English again says to me, you don't do the same thing for all of your clients because they don't have the same attributes. They have different incorporation strategies, they have different ownership, control methodologies, different lines of business, different jurisdictions, etc., 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 different products, different services. So we have to treat them differently. They present an elevated or a reduced or a simplified level of due diligence requirement on us. So again, what we're looking at here is understanding and identifying the triggers that we would normally associate with a change in the overall KYC. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. We are going to go to a poll question if we have time. I'm not hearing that we don't. So what I would like to ask is, which of these industry challenges are currently most relevant to you? So that would be regulatory pressure, credit losses, time to market, radical changes in macro environment, digital transformation, or all of the above. So hopefully you have the ability to answer those. Okay, I am conscious of time, so what I'll do, I think we'll move on to the next slide, if that's okay, please. Thank you very much indeed. So what we would like to look at next is talking about control, which is effectively how a company is owned. Now, this is a relatively simplistic model, but it is in fact based on a real example. And as you can see, company A is owned by shareholder A, shareholder B, and shareholder C. I say owned, but the ownership is disproportionate. Shareholders B and C have roughly 50% each, but shareholder A has 1%. Now, Under normal circumstances and under usual KYC requirements, the 1% shareholder would be broadly ignored. But what we need to understand is that this particular organization has to work through coalitions. Therefore, a majority has to be established. So all of a sudden, the 1% shareholder has the ability, as shareholder B does and shareholder C does, to make decisions only on the premise that they are then connected with shareholder B or shareholder C. So again, it's important to understand ownership, but it's much more important to understand control. And as you can see, shareholder A probably would be missed by most KYC programs. I think we can safely say that. And I'm not saying that's necessarily right or necessarily wrong, but if you want to understand how a company is managed and how it's going to be working going forward, we need to identify that individual, and we need to understand their significance within the organization. So again, if we could move on to the next question, I'm going to pass poll question 2, if that's okay, because I am mindful that we are slightly against it. So if we could move on to the slide after that one, please. There we go. Thank you very much indeed. So really quickly, we talked about data, we talked about technology, we talked about people. Typically, many of the organizations that I've worked in are incredibly bottom heavy in this instance, if you will. They have a huge amount of people, effectively unsustainable resource. A lot of the technology that's in place is underused, and the data is probably overused. There's too much of it, and we don't know what to do with it. So how do we minimize risk and cost in our compliance program? Well, compliance costs are spiraling to many organizations as we do more and invest more heavily. And this is more common of what we see in a financial institution, but what is the optimum balance, we ask? So while regulations are unlikely to directly state that customer screening for things like adverse media are a requirement, you are obliged to carry out an effective risk assessment. So how can you look a regulator in the eye and say that you have assessed risks that you aren't aware of? The example that I tend to use is you have an individual who is a PEP, but they're a low-level PEP, which you might be identified by your screening system if you're looking at sanctions and PEPs, but you run the risk potentially of allowing a convicted money launderer to enter your business. They may not be a PEP, they may not be sanctioned, but they have certainly been accused and found guilty of a financial crime. So again, it's very important that we understand the data that we have and what the technology is doing with it so that a person can make an informed, dare I say it, a better, faster decision. So if we could move on to the next slide, please, that hopefully will resolve the issue. There we go. So have we got the balance right is the question. And I think this is probably slightly more likely to be the case because technology is weighing a bit heavier now. People are in the middle, which again, I think is accurate, but data probably is still going to be the first among equals in this particular instance, because we have to understand that that is absolutely fundamental. Data and technology obviously are going to be constantly evolving and improving. And again, it's quite conceivable that most financial institutions, certainly the smaller ones, will have less resources to work with. So again, it's vitally important that we have that balance right. And again, data is as possibly more important than technology. But again, without the right technology, the data is effectively useless. We've seen instances in the past of where the right technology is in place, fines can still be processed because the data isn't being processed correctly and or individuals aren't making the right decisions. So again, it's very, very important that we have that correlation and that link between data, people and technology. So the next slide is a poll question. So again, if we could pass on that one, please, and move on to Perpetual KYC. Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. So I talked about Perpetual KYC being data-driven, and again, it is effectively managed by a process of trigger factors. So when there is a change in circumstances. So again, typically, you would onboard a high-risk client, you would review their KYC within a 12-month window. A lot can and does happen within that 12-month period. And again, from a low-risk point of view, a lot can and will happen in 3 or maybe even 5 years, depending upon the outlook that you have in your organization. But what we're saying here is, Perpetual KYC can become a reality. And as I mentioned, standards need to be determined and applied in terms of onboarding new clients and ensuring that existing clients are brought up to current standards as soon as possible. And in practice, this would typically be referred to as remediation. And I'm sure many of us on the call will know and understand how complicated and challenging that can be. So we need to understand entity resolution. We need to understand control, third-party disclosures as well, understanding from the client who they're doing business with, where they're doing business, products, services, vendors, etc. It's understanding the supply chain as well. And all of these factors need to be combined so that you can take a holistic view of the client and determine a baseline. And then in terms of AML risk, a rating can be established and then move forward. Once determined, next stage of the process involves which risks are considered material, such as a change in ownership or control, or an adverse media screening alert. Other factors, as I mentioned, will need to be considered, such as primary lines of business and their existing potential jurisdictions where they operate, and also where they are physically or commercially present, as well as products used. And trade finance would be the immediate example that would spring to mind there. So again, we need to understand our client. Your customers need to be considered and understand any downstream implications. A presentation that I gave recently talked about an organization that was owned by a company that was state-owned, and that state-owned enterprise was in fact themselves subject to sanctions. So again, very important that we understand the difference between ownership and control. So again, we've talked about the potential change in client lifecycle management. We've talked about understanding our client. We've talked about the way that we would look to manage that relationship going forward. I wouldn't say it's frictionless, but it's reduced friction in terms of the amount of KYC interaction that we need to have with a client. And again, very often we talk of silos in financial institutions, not talking to each other and not necessarily being well served by the overall infrastructure of an organization. And again, what we're looking to do here is very much manage KYC by exception rather than rule. And I think that's a really important message to get across. The next slide is our final polling question, which I will pass on if that's okay. So if we could move on to key takeaways, please. Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed. So again, I just wanted to leave you with a few final thoughts. I have sort of rattled through the slides a little bit, so please, if there are any questions, do let me know. But again, just wanted to leave you with this thought. The technology is there. It absolutely is there, so we might as well use it. It's there, and it's there for a reason. We know it works, we know it's effective, and we know that in time it will improve things like artificial intelligence, machine learning, etc. I want to get across the message that compliance done right is a facilitator of good business. It's a good cost. It's money well spent. It's an investment in the future success of an organization. I want to talk about people and technology being important because they are, but in the context of what we've been discussing today, one could argue that data is paramount. Again, the expression I would use is it's the first among equals. And then finally, perpetual KYC, which is managing KYC by exception, has to be the way forward, certainly from a sustainability point of view, from a client perspective, and equally from a financial point of view as well. It's much more efficient, much more effective. So again, apologies for sort of rattling through those slides rather quickly, but do we have time for any questions or do we need to move on? I shall take it from the silence that there are no questions. And I'm also mindful that we're right at the top of the hour. Fine. Well, I shall conclude my presentation there and say thank you very much for listening. I do appreciate it. If there are any questions or if anybody would like me to share the slides, please let me know, and we will be happy to discuss any other consultations that people might be interested in or a further explanation of what it is that we're currently doing at Moody's Analytics. But thank you again.